If you have a Bible, would you open it to Esther chapter 2? We live in a time of transition. We started this series last week, and I want to make sure that we go back and hit some of this again. It's a liminal time when everything appears to be up in the air. Our society is not what it once was, and we're honestly not sure what it will be. And in the middle of that, what we see is we see extremes rising on every side. We end up asking the question, how do people of faith live in a world that's kind of gone mad? And so that's why we're studying this kind of dark and violent book of Esther. And honestly, we put PG-13 signs up on the doors there because Esther really needs a PG-13 at least rating. If we're honest with the book, there's lots of sex, there's lots of binge drinking, there's lots of people getting impaled. That's just the way that this book goes. So let's take a second very quickly and let's back up. Last week we were introduced to King Xerxes, or as they would have called him, Ahasuerus, which is in Hebrew, it sounds like King Headache, because that's what he was for them. Here's the deal. He's the most powerful man on the planet at this time. There's no way around that. The most powerful man on the planet. He's greater than any pharaoh. He runs basically from Ethiopia all the way up across the Middle East, all the way over to India. His kingdom is huge. And then we were introduced to Vashti. It was his queen. Beautiful gal. After the king had been drinking and partying for about a week, he calls for her, and it's a dark moment. And she says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. To the point to where for her to refuse is likely that she's going to be killed. She's banished. There's no queen at this point. And then we're introduced to two other characters, a guy by the name of Mordecai. He's a Jewish man. He's a Jewish man with a pagan name. He stayed in Persia when all of his folks went back to Jerusalem. He could have gone home, but he stayed there. And then there's Esther, or Hadassah. She's a gal with two names as well. She's got her Jewish name, but then she goes by Esther. She's a extremely good-looking young lady, is what the text says. And she's been taken at this point, along with all the rest of the young gals who weren't married, taken to Xerxes' harem for a chance to become queen. So each week as we go through, we're taking a month to go through this book. So in a month, we're going to cover quite a bit. Each week we'll take a couple, think of it like this, like Act 1, Scene 1 and 2, and today we're going to do Act 2, Scene 1, 2, and 3. And yes, 1, 2, and 3. It's a bunch. I'm here to tell you each one of these could be a sermon. Put your seatbelts on. I'm going to throw a lot at you today. But as we take each of these, we're going to ask some questions, because I think each scene requires a few questions. Who, why, and how? That's what we're going to address today as we get into the text. So, Act 2, Scene 1, Esther chapter 2. I'm going to start in verse 16. We're talking about Esther now, was taken to King Ahasuerus in the palace in the 10th month, the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won favor and approval from him, or more favor and approval from him than any of the other virgins. He placed a royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. The king held a great banquet for all his officials and staff. It was Esther's banquet. He freed his provinces from the tax payments and gave gifts worthy of the king's bounty. So let's back up here real quick. Remember, Vashti was banished, and then there's a time frame difference here. In between this time is when he went to war. The Battle of 300 happened. He lost. He was embarrassed. The God King was embarrassed. He comes back here When I say the God King, make sure they called him that. He is no God. He's a man, but that's what they called him. He came back, and now we have a few years difference here. And in this time, what happened was they gathered all the young gals who hadn't been married. They were rounded up. Now think about the size of his kingdom. It goes all the way from Ethiopia to India. And so all of these young gals in marrying age, here early teens to late teens, are all taken to one of his harems. They would receive a year of a special diet, beauty treatments, exercise, whole thing, a year for one night with him. They prepared them for a year of one night for him, and they got to take whatever they wanted for that evening. Honestly, I'm not going to lie, I've got no idea what all that's about. Don't even want to know. But they would be dropped off in the evening and picked up in the morning, and afterwards you would go to a different harem. And if he was impressed with you and remembered your name, he would call back. If not, you lived as a widow for the rest of your life. Because for a gal to have been, this is law with Xerxes, it was illegal for her to ever be with another man the rest of her life. So what is he doing is he's erasing a generation of young women. Just erasing them. It's an awful story. This is not a beauty pageant. Esther, though, seems to stand out from the beginning. She was stunning. The author tells us, now when we read the book of Esther, we don't know who the author is. Some have suggested Esther. I don't think that's the case at all. Some have suggested Mordecai, because later in the book it says that he wrote everything down. I think that's probably a pretty good guess. But whoever the author is states that she has a beautiful figure and extremely good looking. That's the way that he describes her. And Haggai, who is the head kind of he's over this harem, he notices Esther from the beginning. And so with her, he speeds up the process. She's the 5-star recruit. He says, no, here maybe, so she doesn't need to go through the whole year. He shortens all that up so that he can get Esther in front of the king. Cousin Mordecai would stroll past the courtyard every now and then and check. How's she doing? Make sure that she didn't tell anyone she was a Jew. Make sure that no one knows who you really are. And when the moment came, she won the crown. She becomes the queen. And you go, what an odd and dark story. Now, here's the deal. I've readily admit that when it comes to preaching the book of Esther, the reason why a lot of us don't like to preach the book of Esther is it's really hard to preach. You read that story and you go, great, what do I say based off of that? It's not prescriptive in any fashion. There's no, hey, this is what you should do. Honestly, there's not even a single mention of God in the entire book. And yet I believe that it's incredibly important for us, even this odd and dark story. Everyone in it is compromised, assimilated. At this point, there are no clear heroes anywhere in this text. But the question that I ask when I get through this is, I go, who would do that? Who would do that? Esther, when you read, the verbs are all passive. She's taken, she doesn't go. She is taken. But once she gets in the system, she works it. Once she gets in there, she takes charge and ends up winning the crown. And I go, why didn't she resist? Why didn't she tell anyone about her faith? Why doesn't she run? But my questions are more important for Mordecai, because I say, why would he let this happen? How does he do that? You come into my house and say you're going to take one of my kids, it's going to go a bit differently. Why didn't he fight? Why didn't he at least take Esther and run? I mean, there are loads of Jews that are back in Jerusalem at this point. The question is why, and here's the truth. Got no idea. None at all. The author gives no information here. Nothing. It's easy to analyze everyone else's situation from a safe distance. It's easy to sit back and commentate on what you would do. It's easy to sit back and say, man, if I was in that, here's what would have happened. We have no idea, though, about their motives, their past, their traumas, their anxieties. In other words, we've got no idea why they did what they did. Here's the reality is you and I don't like when people commentate on our lives from a safe distance as well. When someone says, man, if I was in his case, here's what I would have done. Here's what I would have done. We don't like when people analyze our decisions without knowing our story. We appreciate the mercy of at least being heard. Last week I argued that Esther and Mordecai's names were a reminder of their compromise, their assimilation into Persian culture. That is true. But what if they're also a reminder of loss and wounds? Esther lost her parents so very young. Her way of life as a Jew gone. What's Mordecai's story? I've got no idea. Yes, they are probably calloused and honestly cowardly, but they are molded by a calloused and cowardly society. We don't know their stories. Here's why this is important. What if the church, and when I say the church, I mean you and me, because remember, the church corporate will never do any more than the church individual. This is up to us. What if we decided to withhold judgment on folks when we hear the latest? When we hear the latest gossip, the latest news? Can you believe that? What if we first made the hard choice to say, hey, why don't you come over for dinner? Hey, why don't we grab coffee? Let's sit down, look each other in the eye. Let me hear your story. What if we refuse to talk about everyone, or, pardon me if I step on your toes here, vent on social media until we talk to people? And I can hear it now because there's someone going, I don't even need to hear about that because sin is sin. What about truth? Yes, we are people of truth, but go with me for just a second. What if we took a minute to hear their side before we started bashing folks? Your life is complicated, I can promise you that. My life is complicated. Assume that's the case for other people too. Because grace without truth is hypocrisy, but truth without grace is brutality. There's no way around that. And let me let you in on a little secret too. If you don't have any relational equity with the person, they don't care what you think already. So how about we just stop and we sit down with folks, invite them over. Imagine how much further their church would get in society if we took a moment to be known as people of mercy, and we just sat and listened. We said, let me hear your story. Let me hear about your life. I think that Eugene Peterson got this well in his paraphrase of Scripture, The Message, James 2:12 and 13. He wrote this: talk and act like a person expecting to be judged by the rule that sets us free. For if you refuse to act kindly, you can hardly expect to be treated kindly. Kind mercy wins over harsh judgment every time. It just does. What if the church was known as a place of mercy? What if the people of Jesus were primarily known as people of mercy? Oh, but we're just getting started here. Our story's just getting started. Remember, let's step into scene 2 now. Cousin Mordecai, remember, he likes to go and walk through the city gates. That's sort of where all of the latest gossip happens. That's where commodity happens. It's just an edge where the gates. So if you're visiting a city and you had business to do, you check in here at the gates and the city elders, the uppity-ups, and hang out there. So he'd notice, and he overhears something sinister. Some of Xerxes' eunuchs are plotting to kill him. They're upset about something it doesn't say, but it's not hard to imagine. Think about this. Forgive me for being forward if you're not familiar with the term. Their opportunities to have a family have been removed. That's the kindest way that I can say that. And here's Xerxes rounding up all the gals from 3 continents so he can choose. And yet they're there to oversee that with no opportunity for children, no opportunity for a future. You can see how someone would get upset about that. And a couple of them decide, we're going to kill him. We're going to kill this guy. Mordecai hears about it, and because he's a good citizen. Remember in Jeremiah 29, it says, you pray for the peace of the city. You be a good citizen. He turns them in, and those guys, depending on what your text says, they're either hung from gallows or impaled. I think that's probably more likely. They're put up on spikes for everyone to see. You don't do this to the God King. You're not going to do that here. Now, here's where this gets interesting for me. Mordecai just saved the king. He just saved Xerxes' life. And you go, oh, that's probably not a real threat. Here's the deal. 20 years later, he would be killed by the captain of his bodyguard and one of the head eunuchs. He dies and they kill him. Yes, this threat is very, very real. And Mordecai just saved his life. Remember when you read your text, we put the verse numbers and chapter numbers in there? So it's intended to be read solid. We add those breaks. Chapter 3, verse 1. It goes like this, the end of 2. Mordecai saves his life. Chapter 3, verse 1. After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the officials. The question that I ask when I get here is, I go, why? Why does a bad guy always seem to win? Why didn't Mordecai get the job? Mordecai saved his life, Haman got a raise. What kind of sense is that? Isn't that the way it works? You think you do what's right and someone else gets credit for it. Someone else gets the promotion. You know what I'm thinking if I'm here? Next time I'll keep my mouth shut. Wouldn't blame him. It all seems so very, very unfair. Mordecai saves Xerxes' life and nothing. Nothing. Mordecai saves the king from an assassination attempt, and he doesn't get so much as an attaboy. Not a handshake, not anything at this point. This is why I love the book of Esther. It looks an awful lot like our lives. So just before this is written, you have Daniel written as well. Daniel's just a few years before this. Now, here's the thing. Daniel is the superstar. Every time he steps up to the plate, he hits it out of the park. He just does, right? He refuses to pray. Not refuses to pray. I got that story backward. He insists on praying. Dan's back there shaking his head going, this is why you stay on your notes, kid. Look, he says, I'm going to pray, gets chucked in a lion's den. All of a sudden, the lions are vegans. And you're like, how in the world does that happen? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. We know their story. If you're familiar with the VeggieTales version, it's Rack, Shack, and Benny. They refuse to bow, get chucked into the furnace. Jesus is in there hanging out with them. And you're like, yes, these are heroes of the faith. In the book of Esther and in my life, you try and it all goes wrong. It just all seems to fall apart. You do something good and someone else gets the raise. And you go, where's God? Why in the world is that happening? What we will see as the story develops is just because you don't see God at work doesn't mean he's not there. Just because you don't see what he's doing doesn't mean that he's not doing 10,000 things that you don't even understand. All this will come together. And honestly, the work of God is often best and most accurately observed in the rearview mirror. It's once we've gone through and we're able to put a little distance and we can say, I see what God did here. I see what he did here. The old preachers used to say, trust his heart when you can't trace his hand. Trust his heart when you can't trace his hand. We read it last week, Jeremiah 29. All Mordecai's doing is being a good citizen. He's doing what he should do. The reality is, doing the right thing is always the right thing to do, regardless of who gets the credit, regardless of how it works out. I can remember a time in our lives, we were trying to do something that we thought God was leading us in. We thought that we were following Scripture, and everything went painfully wrong. Just everything. And my wife used to put up little 3x5 cards, everywhere. They were on the mirror, they were on our refrigerator, they were on the window above the sink. Everywhere we would see it, Proverbs 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart, right? Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him. He'll make the path straight. Trust when you try to do things right and it all just blows up in your face. Because the right thing to do is always the right thing to do. And what we would find through time was God was always at work. But God is not, and I don't like this, but He's under no obligation to tell me what He's doing. I prayed, Lord, would you let me in on this? And He consistently says no. He consistently doesn't work in my time frame. He doesn't even seem to be concerned with what I feel about the situation. But He's always good and He's always right. And He always does things. And He's always at work, even when I don't see it. And we have to trust that it's right to make the right decisions, regardless of how it works out. We have to trust the way that God made us in His image. Because justice, doing the right thing, is a part of how He made us. He is a God of justice. And because we're made in His image, justice is part of who we are. I can prove it to you easy. I'll give you two ways. One, let a small child go to the park and someone take their ball. What do they always yell? That's not fair. Justice is part of who we are. The other way I'll prove it to you is there are 323 different versions of NCIS. We love justice. We love that sort of thing. It's part of who we are. The problem is we dull our sensitivities. We dull our hearts until the only justice that we're concerned about is the justice that aligns with our agenda. That's where that gets hard. In years past, the church is sort of divided into two different, we've divided over a lot of things. Why? Because we're broken people. But we've divided over this in particular. Some wanted to focus on social issues, so they called it the social gospel. Part of the church went there. Depending on your background, sort of divides that because our experience matters. And another side of the church said, no, we need to focus on doctrinal issues. We need to focus on truth, not so much focus on that. I'm here to tell you, if you pay attention to the life of Jesus, He was vastly concerned with both. For us to be the church, we have to be concerned about doing the right thing. If your theology leads you to focus on God, but not to be concerned about other people and whether or not right things are happening, there's something broken in your theology. Period. There's no way around that. I didn't appreciate this at the time, but I do now. I'm thankful that I was taught as a boy that the right thing to do is the right thing to do, regardless of how it works out. The right thing to do is simply always the right thing to do. It was the case in Mordecai's world, and it is in ours as well. We're called to act justly. We're called to act justly. But as if this text wasn't crazy enough, if it wasn't crazy enough, let's keep going. Scene 3. Look at verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down, hang on. I jumped ahead here. When Haman gets the raise, when Haman gets the new job, everybody needs to show homage to Haman because he's the new muckety-muck. Everybody's got to salute. Everybody's got to bow. That's the way it is. All right, now back to where I was. I jumped to that part in my notes. I apologize. When Haman saw that Mordecai wasn't bowing down or paying homage, he was filled with rage. If you're ever in the military and you forget to salute, you will learn this. They're suddenly filled with rage. And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. Haman saw that Mordecai refused to bow down to him, and he saw red. This is one of those parts of Scripture where the devil's in the details. We have to dig in here just a bit because this will all make more sense to you. We're first introduced to Mordecai. We're given his lineage. He's the son of Kish. That means he's a Benjamite. There was a famous king that came from there. Kish's son was a guy named Saul. He was the very first king of Israel. And also, when we're introduced to Haman, we're told that he's an Agagite. That's important as well. That means that he's one, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, it's called the Amalekites. He's an Amalekite. Oh, and suddenly this story will start to make a bit more sense. When the Israelites first left Egypt, remember that? Moses saying, "Let my people go," they all go out. When they left, the Amalekites snuck around from the back and started attacking them. They killed women and kids. They killed the elderly. They're terrorists. So much so that Moses in Deuteronomy said, "You don't ever forget this about the Amalekites, and don't you ever even forgive them." That was word from Moses now. That's how these people couldn't stand each other. Then, that king, Saul, the one in Haman's ancestor, remember, his task was to wipe out the Amalekites, so much so that God said, "I want King Agag to die." What? Haman the Agagite. He's a descendant of Agag. Saul was supposed to kill. His great-great-grandpa was supposed to kill the other great-great-great-grandpa. And he didn't, and it cost him his throne. Oh my. You talk about ancient racism, ancient hatred. It is on full display between these two. Haman figures out that he's a Jew, and he says, "Oh, no. I'm not just going to kill him." This keeps getting darker. He says, "I'm going to kill his whole family. No, I'm going to kill all his people." And he goes and tells that to Xerxes, and Xerxes says, "Sounds good to me." Just goes along with it. The question I ask is, how did you get here? How did this happen? Even if we understand some of their past animosity, how do we move from hating one person to murdering an entire race? How does Xerxes and his officials just go along with it? There's two aspects here of how evil works that we need to pay quick, and I'm quickly running out of time, but I want to touch on this because it's important. You can almost see evil growing in Haman's mind. "Oh, I'm going to kill Mordecai. No, I'll kill his family. No, I'm going to kill them all." When we allow evil to sit in our minds, remember, evil never drifts towards holiness. What happens is it grows and it gets darker and darker and darker. We see this throughout time. We see it with Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Idi Amin. We see this sort of thing happen. The old preachers would say, sin will take you further, keep you longer, and cost you more than what you could ever imagine. We see this in lesser, but just as deadly as well. When we allow sin to take root and a hold of our minds, it starts to grow. We see examples of this where pornography gets into a family and it starts to grow, and sooner or later it takes over a family. We've seen this in cases where folks let things in their families that shouldn't be there. And what happens is we start to live out alternate realities. And pretty soon you're going, how in the world did we get here? How in the world did this become so bad? That's why Paul says you take every thought captive. Every thought captive. Don't allow that to hang out there. But also there's this ordinary evil here of Xerxes just going along with the plans, and we'll see the officials just going, "Hey, that's cool, let's kill them all." There's this evil that we let in our lives, and it just escalates. But then there's times when we just go along when we know that we ought to stand up and say, "That's enough of that. I'm not going to go along with that." As people of faith in a secular world, we have to walk carefully. We have to walk humbly. recognizing the way that evil works and recognizes that we need grace every single day. We need to reorient our minds to God every single day. If we're going to be, as Jesus put it, shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves, I need to walk with Jesus every single day to make sure that I'm not only seeing right, but I'm making the right choices for me and my family. As I was writing this, honestly, it sort of overwhelmed me, and I was thinking, man, that's big. You realize the humility it takes to walk before God, just saying, I need you today to keep me out of that mess. I need Jesus to help me for where I've already been in that mess. I got a feeling I'm going to need him tomorrow. So we have 3 quick scenes here. I get that I just hit you with a fire hose. But follow the story. 3 scenes. Esther becomes queen, and you go, how would a family member allow another one to do that? And we're reminded that you and I need to be people of mercy. We need to be willing to hear folks. Mordecai saves Xerxes, and Haman gets a new job for it. You go, how's that happen? We're reminded that we need to be people of justice regardless of how it ends. Regardless. And then Haman goes out and planning murder, and you say, how do we get here? And we're reminded, you and I better walk carefully. It's striking because one of my favorite books of the Bible, one of my favorite verses of the Bible is Micah 6:8, where he goes, he's shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? Think about this. In the middle of this was written in the middle of messed up worship and bad attitudes and everything else. And he says, get this down. What does the Lord require of you? Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. And I go, oh my. When I look at those 3 scenes, I see it, or a lack thereof it, lived out. So Thrive Church, what do I need to do? Seek justly, do the right thing, regardless of how it works out. Love mercy. I'm going to sit and I'm going to choose, before I start judging, I'm going to sit and I want to hear your story. I'm going to be a person of mercy. But I'm also going to walk comfortably knowing that before I ever talk to someone about Christ, I need to realize that I need a Savior too. And evil can get into my life fast. And when it does, what's it do? It always grows. Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Pray with me. Father, that's a bunch, but it seems very timely. Would you work in my life today? Would you work in the lives of those who are here today? All because you're awesome and all for your glory. Amen.